This is the KC Show. I'm Kyle Cushman, and welcome inside a brand new PWHL podcast series. I've been waiting all summer and now into the fall to get this started, and I'm super excited to bringing you the first episode of an 8-part series where we're diving into every single PWHL team before the season opener on November 21st. Beginning today with the Boston Fleet. We're going to be doing deep dives into each roster, look back at the moves they made in the summer, the big questions going into the season. I'm going to be taking some of your questions as well to really look at all the different angles going into the new season for each of these teams. Beginning today with the Boston Fleet, who I think are one of the most interesting teams going into this new season. You have a new head coach, the only established franchise with a new head coach at the helm, with Courtney Kessel moving on to Princeton and Chris Spar coming over from the AHL as a new women's hockey coach. You have the departures of Hilary Knight and Hannah Bilka as well up front. 5 defenders from the regular lineup last season, all moving on. So you have this mix of a really fascinating team of established players still on the roster, but a lot of new faces, a lot of youth on the roster, and maybe a bit of a roster that's being overlooked in terms of the pieces that they have coming off of a season where they missed the playoffs. And I think it's important to start with how last season ended, of course, where Hannah Bilka was injured for a stretch and then she comes back after the Worlds, but then Alina Muller goes down at the Worlds and misses the end of the season. And so you really have this middle to end of the season stretch where the Boston Fleet don't have a fully healthy lineup. They go into the final day of the regular season. They get Aaron Frankel back for that final game of the season, and it's a complete dud. They get blown out by the Minnesota Frost. They miss out on a playoff spot. But before we get ahead to everything that happened after that, just think about how important that game is in the entire history of the PWHL. If Boston wins that game, Minnesota misses the playoffs. And so we're not talking about everything that the Frosts have done the last 2 years as back-to-back Walter Cup champions. We're not talking about Boston maybe without some, or maybe we're talking about Boston in a different light if they made the playoffs for a second straight year. Maybe they go on to a Walter Cup. Maybe they win the damn thing. It's impossible to know how things would play out in that alternate timeline, but it's fascinating to think about how different this league would look, whether that's decisions that the Fleet would make in terms of the expansion process and some other things like that, and also how we view the Minnesota Frost instead of being back-to-back champions. It's a fascinating alternate timeline to look at in terms of how that one regular season game could potentially change the entire course of the league's history going into season 3 and beyond. But first, let's look at the changes that the Fleet have going into this season. And there's a lot. I mentioned the big one off the top, of course, with Courtney Kessel moving on to Princeton, being replaced by Chris Spar as head coach. But it's not just that. You have a lot of players being turned over on the roster. Hilary Knight, Hannah Bilka, Alexia Gia, Amanda Pelkey, and Jillian Dempsey all moving on from the forward group from last season. Sydney Morin, Jess DiGirolamo, Emily Brown, Sydney Bard, and Emma Greco on the back end. And then also goaltenders Emma Soderberg and Klara Pechlarova, who both opted to go back to Sweden. So out of all of those players, Knight, Bilka, Brown, and Bard all leaving in the expansion process, 2 retirements in Pelkey and Dempsey, and then the rest opting to leave in free agency. Significant changes to the Boston roster in that regard. They also made quite a few of additions in the offseason. Free agent additions up front in Liz Sheppers, Chloe Orard, Laura Kluga, and then adding 3 forwards in the draft in Ella Huber, Olivia Mobley, and Abby Newhook. On the back end, free agent additions, Zoe Boyd and Rylan McKinnon, as well as draftees Haley Wynn and Riley Brangman. And then finally in net, free agent addition, Abby Levy and draftee Amanda Thiele. All that to be said, significant changes across the roster, both in the expansion process and the free agency process. Let's look at some of the additions first before we get to some of the big questions here. I love the signing of Liz Sheppers, who is a very formidable fourth line center who has proved in back-to-back Walter Cup runs that she's a legit player that can play on a championship winning team, considering the fact that she scored the Walter Cup winning goal in back-to-back years. She's somebody that I look at as maybe stepping up into a bigger role this upcoming season, a player who hasn't played much more than just a typical fourth line role. And I wonder if we can maybe see her play a little bit more than we maybe expect coming into this season. Another free agent ad that I really love, and I think a lot of people expected to see happen and did happen, is Chloe Orard going back to Boston. Of course, she hasn't played for the Boston Fleet, but going back to Boston because she was a stalwart at Northeastern in her collegiate days, and doing that on a line with Alina Muller. And talking with Muller this summer, she talked about Orard as one of those players that she has the most chemistry with that she's played with in her entire career. She actually mentioned it was Orard, and the other name she mentioned was longtime Team Switzerland line mate Laura Stalder. So that's pretty high company to be in for Orard when talking about Mueller there. So that's an obvious potential fit for a line mate of Mueller's going into this new season. A really intriguing addition because she was so productive in college at Northeastern alongside Mueller and just really hasn't found her groove in the PWHL yet on a New York Sirens team. Maybe she can find that here with the Boston Fleet. The other particularly notable free agent additions are Zoe Boyd, who we're going to get into a little bit more in a second, and Abby Levy, just a solid backup option, a player that not that long ago was Team USA's third goaltender at the World Championships, hasn't really put together the kind of performances you would hope for in the PWHL yet, but she's a backup goaltender who has some upside and is a player that I think is a perfectly capable backup goaltender in the PWHL. At the draft, though, I really like what Danielle Marmer was able to accomplish. Their second overall pick, Haley Wynn, was my number one prospect in the draft. Just the combination of her age as one of the youngest players in the draft, right-handed defender, offensive from the blue line, elite skating, just all the attributes that Wynn brings to the table, in addition to already having that Team USA experience. Like, she's literally a top 4 defender on Team USA right now. I thought she was the number one prospect in the draft, and I thought it was a great job by Marmer and company to snag her with the second overall pick, especially considering how much they needed another difference maker on the blue line. But it wasn't just there. With their second round pick, Ella Huber, she was a first round grade for me. I would have seriously considered taking her anywhere from 6th to 9th overall before she ended up going at 10th overall to the Boston Fleet. And I just really like her combination of speed, transition skill, a proven ability to play with elite talent as well, with her history alongside Abby Murphy. I just really like everything that she brings to the table as a potential top 6 center right out of the gate, and somebody that can play with that elite talent. I think she's somebody that's going to surprise the season, and another player that we're going to get to a little bit more in a few minutes' time. Rounding out the draft class with some depth picks that I also liked. Olivia Mobley is a player that drives the net hard, is a player that can chip in on the penalty kill as well. Doesn't have to play in your top 6, can play on a fourth line and can give you some good minutes. She's a player that I really liked in the 3rd round. And then you also have some depth picks who I think could potentially play roles lower in the lineup or more infrequently minutes wise. And that's Abby Newhook, a player who I was a little surprised was available as late as she was. Somebody that could be a fourth line, either center or winger, could maybe pop offensively given some time. Riley Brangman, always a good idea to draft Ohio State defenders. Somebody that is probably going to mix into the regular lineup this upcoming season, or at least challenge for that role. And then finally, Amanda Thiele, a goaltender at Ohio State who didn't have the best season last year, but has a solid track record and at most is going to be the 3rd string goaltender. So that's the recap of everything that went on this offseason for the Boston Fleet. Let's look at my 5 big questions going into the season for the Fleet. And number 1 being, does Alina Muller move back to center? If you were following along last season, you noticed that Alina Muller played almost exclusively on the left wing last year. In fact, of all the games I had tracked in terms of the lineup sheets, she only lined up at center once in her entire PWHL career. It's now 43 games on the wing and 15 at center based off of the games that I have the lineup sheets tracked for. I think there might be a game or two that I have missing from that data. But overall, in her PWHL career now, it is a lot more on the wing than at center, which is maybe a bit of a surprise considering she's such a deft playmaker, a good two-way presence, played center all the way through Northeastern, plays center with Team Switzerland, and yet Courtney Kessel opted to move her to the wing for the most part this season. And it's a bit of a surprise because you don't really think of her as this kind of F1 forechecker who needs to get in on the forecheck, lay the body, anything like that. And she's also good two-way and more of a playmaker than a raw goal scorer. So you think that all of that kind of makes sense as a center rather than a winger. So I'm very interested to see if Muller moves back to center full-time this upcoming season under Chris Spar, because it opens up a very different lineup for the Boston Fleet. Are you running Muller and Tapani down the middle 1-2? Are you running Muller on the wing and Tapani at center alongside her, or on different lines? If those two are both playing center, does that mean Ella Huber, the draft pick, moves to the wing? If Mueller's playing on the wing, does that mean Huber's potentially her center? What does that also mean for other players like Shea Maloney or Abby Newhook, the new draft pick, or Laura Kluge, who was also added in free agency? There's so many different things. Liz Sheppers as well. There's a lot of players on this Fleet roster that can play center. And I think a lot of how this roster construction ends up being in terms of how the lineup is constructed revolves around whether Muller is a center or a winger. I personally probably think her best position is down the middle, but then when I look at the players that they have on this roster, it might make more sense for her to actually play the wing, especially if they want some more size down the middle. Like if you want Shea Maloney and Susanna Tapani to play down the middle, well then you're probably playing Alina Muller on the wing in that case. If you're fine with moving Shea Maloney to the wing or Ella Huber to the wing and having Alina Muller as your first line center, then you can make it work. And I'm sure there are ways that Muller will line up at center over the course of the season, even if she is, again, primarily a winger. But I'm very interested to see if this is something that changes under Chris Spar, something that remains the same under Chris Spar, because that's going to tell us whether this is almost more of an organizational idea from the top down, or whether this was something that was more Courtney Kessel's idea to have Muller on the wing and have some different players play down the middle. So when it comes to Muller on the wing, it frees you up to have players like Shea Maloney play down the middle and have a bit more size down the middle. It maybe frees you up to have Ella Huber play that first line center role and maybe look to her and Muller and Chloe O'Rard. There's a bunch of different ways to look at the lineup construction with Muller at center versus on the wing. So that's one of the big things I'm interested to watch and see how that plays out going into training camp and then at the beginning part of the season. The second big question for me is also something that we'll find out early on in training camp and into the beginning part of the season. Who plays with Megan Keller? Now, I think a lot of people look at the draft pick of Haley Wynn and just automatically put her on the top pairing with Megan Keller. And that's perfectly fine. That might be the case. They might play 25 minutes a night and be one of the best pairings in the entire league and then go to the Olympics and play together and everything will be fine and dandy there. I also think that's a very simplistic way of looking at this roster construction because the rest of the defense group lacks a lot of experience and a lot of players that are trusted or at least proven in the PWHL. You have Zoe Boyd there, but outside of her, it's really a lot of unproven players after Keller and Wynn, and I'm including Wynn in the proven category, even though she is a rookie coming up. You have Daniela Pasheva there, who had an up and down at best rookie season. You have Ryland McKinnon, who was a 6th or 7th defender, again, at best for the Toronto Scepters last year as a rookie. You have Hadley Hartmetz, who barely played as a rookie last year due to injury. And then you have a true rookie in Riley Brangman there, and then a handful of free agent camp invites as well. So if you load up the top pairing with Keller and Wynn, that means you're going to a second pairing who are going to have to play anywhere from 18 to 21 minutes a night with like Zoe Boyd and Daniela Pasheva or Ryland McKinnon or Hadley Hartmetz. And it's not to say that those players can't do that, but it's putting a lot of onus on those players early in the season when maybe you would prefer them to have maybe a bit more of an experienced partner on that defense pairing to help ease them into the season. So for me, I actually don't think that the most likely partner to begin the season for Megan Keller is Haley Wynn. That brings me to Zoe Boyd, who I think ticks all the boxes for somebody that I think would be a great fit on a shutdown pairing with Megan Keller. Boyd, it's fascinating. You look last season, she was a healthy scratch for the first game of the season for the Charge. And for the first handful of games, she played under 10 minutes as the 6th or 7th defender on the roster. Eventually, she moved her way up the lineup, and then in the playoffs was playing a legit top 4 role almost the entire playoff run, playing important minutes in the semifinals against Marie-Philippe Poulin, playing 20 plus minutes a night in overtime games against the Frost in the Walter Cup final. And you look at the way that GM Marmer talked about her at the draft after signing her to the contract that they landed her on in free agency. And Marmer talked about her as a proven top 4 defender in this league now based off of the way she played in the playoffs, and talked about her progression from some of the injury issues she had, or the injury shortened season she had in season 1, to some of the lower minutes she was playing in season 2, her progression throughout. I think she ticks a lot of the boxes for what you might like on a top pairing with Megan Keller. She can play the left and the right. She can play physical. She can play defensive minutes. She doesn't need to have the puck on her stick. It maybe frees up Keller to be a bit more active offensively as well. I really like the idea of Zoe Boyd on the top pairing alongside Megan Keller. And then that frees you up to have Haley Wynn on the second pairing with Daniela Pecheva or Ryland McKinnon. And yes, that's a young pairing, but I think having Wynn in that secondary role then frees her up to play even more offensively and get the most out of her as well, rather than having her on the top pairing, the shutdown pairing, the matchup pairing that you're going to be playing against all the top teams. Maybe you can get her some softer minutes, especially early in the season, ease her in and maybe get her going offensively there. The other player that I think is a candidate to play on the top pairing here is Hadley Hartmetz. And that one might come as a surprise because she was a later round draft pick, barely played last year. And you might think, well, why wouldn't Riley Brangman, the draft pick that was just taken, maybe be more the candidate in the top 4? Well, there's reasons why Hadley Hartmetz didn't play much last season, and it's due to injury. She was injured at the end of Ohio State's championship run in her final season in the NCAA, which caused her to drop in the draft, which caused her to miss almost the entire season last year. She got into 2 games, barely played in both of those with Boston, spent much of the season either on LTIR or on the reserve list. So going into this year, I'm very intrigued by Hartmetz because her last season at Ohio State was phenomenal. She was involved offensively, had a great plus minus, scored against top teams as well. Wasn't like she was just picking up points against bottom feeders and wasn't really doing anything against top teams either. She's a right-handed defender as well who could step onto a top pairing and maybe do a job alongside Megan Keller, because then that really gives you a rounded out top 4 of Zoe Boyd and Haley Wynn on a second pairing and gives you 2 pairings that you probably trust in a lot of situations. Of course, that being if Hartmetz can find that game again after a healthy offseason going into this year, albeit not having played really any games consistently for a long time here. So that's an interesting one that I'm very keyed in on to watch early this season, because I truly think that Megan Keller on pure talent is a top 2, top 3, top 4 at worst defender in the PWHL in women's hockey. I love her mix of offensive ability, shutdown game, physicality, leadership, all of it. Megan Keller brings all of it to the table. And finding whoever that partner for her this season is going to be, I think is going to be a big key to what the rest of the roster ends up looking like over the course of this season. To my third big question going into the season for the Boston Fleet, and I think it's probably the long-term one that matters the most. Is the loss of Hilary Knight too much to overcome? Hilary Knight is a one of one, both in terms of her impact on the ice, her impact off the ice, her play style, the just magnetic persona that she is. And last season, she hit that other gear on the ice for the Fleet. That kind of player we think of Hilary Knight as being. Co-leader in the league in scoring, MVP candidate, forward of the year candidate, and factored into 40% of the Fleet's 5-on-5 goals last season. That's the highest rate in the entire league. Nobody, Sarah Fillier, anyone else was better. So how do you replace that? I think the simple answer is you don't. And that's the tricky part here. You're certainly not replacing it in one player. And if you're replacing it by committee, you're going to have some incoming players really step up in bigger roles than maybe you're expecting or perform better than you're expecting. And you need your established players to hit another level without Knight being there. So if you're looking at maybe a positive of Hilary Knight being there, does that mean that somebody like Alina Muller can take a bigger role offensively on this team as the leader of this team offensively and maybe blossom in that role? It's quite possible. Does that mean that players feel more onus on themselves to perform offensively, that can't just look across the locker room and be like, it's okay, Knighter's got our back? It's possible, but ultimately replacing a player of Hilary Knight's caliber is frankly impossible. And so I am really interested to see how the Fleet go about trying to replace her this season in terms of how their offense is created, the way that the roster is constructed without having that top star at the top of the lineup. Can Alina Muller become that? Does somebody else step up in that role? There's a lot of ways to look at it going into this season, but ultimately losing a player that scored or factored into 40% of your 5-on-5 goals in a year that you ultimately missed the playoffs on, that's the biggest question for the Fleet going into next year. Look, I'm interested about the Mueller stuff and where she plays. I'm interested about who plays with Megan Keller. But really, the biggest question for the Fleet going into this year truly is Knight just too big of a loss to overcome? So we're going to find out over the course of this season whether that is the case or whether they're able to not just keep the core intact going into the future and having Alina Muller, Megan Keller, and Erin Frankel all not just protected in the expansion process, but also re-signed and extended for another 2 years after this season, so locked up for 3 seasons to come, or whether it's going to be a bit of a bumpy season this year without Knight at the top of the lineup, maybe a bit of a retooling year with the new head coach, and then you attack things differently next summer with a new free agent class, a new draftee class, and go into next season after this upcoming year with a bit more of a positive outlook. That's the big question for the Fleet this year. I think there's a way that they can make this year positive, but the big question is, can they do it without Hilary Knight? Number 4, we talked about it a little bit with Chris Spar coming in, replacing Courtney Kessel. What does this new team look like? This is the only established franchise with a new head coach coming into the season. There are other coaching changes around the league in terms of assistants coming and going, but there's no head coach change other than the Boston Fleet for the original 6 franchises. And Chris Spar is somebody that I don't really know what to expect from. I expect him to be a developmental coach, a coach coming from the AHL, and the way that Danielle Marmer has talked about player development in this league. I expect him to be a coach that is striving to get the best out of young players and progress those players and help them find new levels to their games. But in terms of play style and in terms of how this team actually looks on the ice and what kind of coach Chris Spar is, I don't really have any kind of expectations in that regard. So I'm very interested to see how that turns out this season, because it's one thing to be one of those new head coaches out west and coming in from day one and being able to set your standards from day one. I think it's a very different thing for a head coach to be coming into an established franchise, an established program, and one that has seen a lot of changes this summer with the captain moving on to a new team and other significant pieces moving on to new teams, and trying to either reset a culture or continue a culture that was built while you weren't there. So I'm very interested to see what this Chris Spar team looks like, because I don't have a baseline for what that looks like. And of course, something that's been talked about quite a bit as well is Spar comes from the men's hockey world. He's, of course, a men's hockey player who has gone into coaching over the past handful of years and has coached at the junior levels in men's hockey and has coached at the pro levels in Europe in men's hockey and has coached in the AHL in men's hockey. But this is his first foray into women's hockey, and it is a different game. And I'm curious to see how that transition looks for Chris Spar as well. So in addition to all the player changes, Another big change is behind the bench, and it's something that we just really don't have a baseline for, and it's something I'm very interested to watch early on this new season. And my fifth and final big question before getting to your questions is about the defense. We've talked about it a little bit already, but this is the youngest defense group in the league. The average age is just under 25 at 24.8, depending on who ends up making the final roster. Those numbers will change, but that's a good 2+ years younger than every other team in the PWHL and 5 years younger than some of the oldest defense groups in the PWHL. You have experience in Megan Keller. You have a little bit of experience in the league, at least, in Zoe Boyd. But outside of that, you're talking about sophomores from the 2024 draft class and brand new players from the 2025 draft class. It's a very young, inexperienced group. That can be a positive. That can also be a negative. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how this defense group is constructed in terms of who's paired with who, what the minutes allocation ends up being, and who ends up surprising. Because I look at last year and the expectations for Daniela Pasheva after the Fleet traded up to draft her in 2024. She did not play the role that I was expecting at all under Courtney Kessel. She's somebody that's going to have to step up with the losses that the Fleet have on defense. Haley Wynn is obviously second overall pick who's going to be great from day one, but what does Zoe Boyd look like in a bigger role? Can Rylan McKinnon or Hadley Hartmetz or Riley Brangman maybe take bigger roles than we're expecting going into the season? Can any of the free agent invites steal a roster spot and maybe make some noise in training camp and into the starting part of the season? There's a lot of opportunity on this Boston blue line, and a lot of it comes from the inexperience going into the training camp among the players on this group. So looking at the group overall, I just don't really know what to expect from them. It could be the league worst defense group, quite honestly. It could also be a group that surprises and has some positive stories led by Megan Keller at the top and a great rookie season from Haley Wynn and a solidifying top 4 performance from Zoe Boyd and all those things. Like, there are ways that this defense group ends up being very formidable this season, but there's also ways where that youth ends up costing them some games and ends up being something that at the end of a season where we've seen these seasons come down to every point meaning so much, where that youth on the blue line could cost you some games and end up costing you at the end of the season. So looking at this group overall, will the inexperience be an issue? I can't say at this point, but I'm certainly excited to see it play out. Okay, let's get to your questions now, the stuff that you guys actually care to hear about. Took questions from Discord, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll be doing that for all of these shows. So be sure to keep tabs on my feeds all across there to get your questions in for future shows coming up. We'll begin on Discord. This question from Scarin. They ask, do you see Loren Gabel getting more ice time this season? Well, she played under 9 minutes last year and only played over 10 minutes in a handful of games. So really, I don't see a way that it can get lower for a player of Loren Gabel's caliber. In that first season, she played just over 13 minutes a game, had over 12 shots per 60, and last season, playing under 9 minutes per game, that dropped to 6.5. I don't know if there was some injury, personal stuff, anything going on with Gabel as she missed some time last year as well. But I'm hoping that we see a 100% Loren Gabel going into this season, because she's a player that has proven to be a legit offensive difference maker. And that's what this Boston team needs, considering all the pieces they lost up front, because it's not just Hilary Knight. They lost Hannah Bilka, who was a legit top line player when she was healthy and available for the Fleet last year. They lost significant pieces on the back end as well. And so when you look at players that are going to step in and help alleviate some of those losses, one of those internal players that I view as being one of those candidates to do so is Loren Gabel, because she's proven at the pro level in the PHF that she can score 20 goals in 22 games and 40 points in 22 games. She proved in college she can be an elite scorer. She's gotten shots on Team Canada before. That just doesn't go away in one random season. And so for Gabel, I'm hoping she has a healthy season, gets a legit shot in the top 9, maybe even the top 6, because I think with her shooting ability, she's somebody that this Fleet team needs to utilize in roles that she can succeed in if they're going to reach their maximum potential. Let's continue on. Orange Fly on Instagram and Gabrielle_VX on Instagram, both asking about the new coaching staff. What do you think about the coaching change? What do you think of the new coaching staff? In terms of the coaching change itself, it caught me off guard, but it's also not that surprising. Courtney Kessel has a young family. She began her coaching career, or had a significant stint in her coaching career, at Princeton as an assistant. And when that position became available, when Kara Gardner-Morey left to take the GM position for PWHL Vancouver, that's a very intriguing job to take for somebody like Kessel. There's more job security there. You can build something longer term. You don't need to worry about the stressors of pro hockey, which I think are a different beast than what the collegiate game is. And so for all of those factors, I totally get why Courtney Kessel would want to take that job. I do wonder if they made the playoffs for the second year in a row and maybe went on a playoff run, if things would be different there. But that's just not the reality that we live in. So looking at the coaching changes, as talking about earlier with Chris Spar, I just don't really know enough about him in terms of him being a head coach and him being at the helm there in terms of expectations there. And then with a new assistant as well coming in, and Jordan Lavallee-Smotherman, again, and not somebody that I'm super familiar with. So I'm really going in blind to a lot of what this Boston Fleet team is going to look like this season in terms of the coaching decisions behind the bench. To the captaincy, and another question here from Gabrielle_VX on Instagram. Who's going to be the captain, in your opinion? And this one's an easy one for me. I know there are some choices to be made about maybe Alina Muller or strong leader in Jamie Lee Rattray, but ultimately for me, this one is easily Megan Keller. She leads from the back end. I feel like she is on paper the best skater on this roster. I think Erin Frankel's the best player on this roster. I think Megan Keller's the best skater on this roster. And I look at what she does from the back end. She's the backbone of this team. From the back end out, of course, Erin Frankel not really being an option to be the captain as the goaltender there. And I look at Keller, her experience with Team USA, and I think she can be the face of this franchise, taking over from Hilary Knight there as the American on the Boston team, to be at the forefront there. And I think Mueller would be a great choice in her own right. I think Jamie Lee Rattray would be a great choice in her own right. But in terms of a player that I think is a Boston Fleet player for their entire career, and somebody that will be along for many years to come, and somebody that is already locked up for another 2 years after this, and somebody that has those Team USA ties for all of it, I think Megan Keller is just the easy choice to have the captaincy going into this season and for many years to come in Boston. A fun one here from Jay on Twitter asking, who do you see filling the offensive void of Knight aside from the expected Tapani and Mueller? Any sleeper candidates? I love some sleeper candidates. So this is a fun one for me. We already talked about Loren Gabel. I think if she gets a legit top 6 opportunity and gets more offensive zone starts, plays a bigger role on the power play with her goal scoring ability, when she's healthy and at 100%, she's somebody that can certainly step into those roles and be a difference maker and help fill that, again, offensive void of Hilary Knight. Another player, though, that is returning from last year's roster that could take a bigger role offensively is the aforementioned Jamie Lee Rattray. She's had very minimal power play scoring in her PWHL career to this point. She's been efficient at 5-on-5, but overall, I don't think she's quite hit the offensive heights that maybe we expect from a player of her caliber. She's still somebody that is on Team Canada's radar going into the Olympic cycle. She's a versatile Swiss Army knife, can play in all situations at all forward positions. And with Hilary Knight being gone, she can be one of those top leaders on this team, and somebody that I hope takes maybe a step offensively, or maybe finds some more confidence going into this season, or maybe just simply is used in more offensive roles this season to have a bit more scoring behind her belt, or under her belt, I should say, this season. So she's another player that I could see helping fill that offensive void. And then there are 2 additions that I really look at. The first being Chloe Orard. Again, look at her collegiate stats. Ridiculous player in college, and she did that playing on a line with Alina Muller. As mentioned earlier, Alina Muller talked glowingly about Orard and her work ethic on the ice and her chemistry together. And if they elect to play them together, and if it works at the PWHL level, which is a very different level than in college, but if it works in the PWHL, that's a legit 1-2 combo that has deep chemistry over years and years, and is a player that you added in free agency as a low risk, high reward bet. So if Chloe Orard, with her playmaking and some of the speed that she brings, can be that fit with Muller in the top 6, I think that's a home run type signing for Danielle Marmer and this Boston team, and a very exciting addition that can, again, help fill that offensive void of Hilary Knight. And then the last one, Ella Huber. I'm very high on her. As I mentioned earlier, again, somebody that I had a first round grade on. I love her speed, her game in transition. And again, the key here is that she's played a lot over her career with Abby Murphy. She knows how to play as a center with an elite talent. Whether she plays at center or whether she plays on the wing, if she is somebody that ends up being paired with Alina Muller or Susanna Tapani, she knows how to play with those elite, smart, elite offensive talents. And she's somebody that I think is honestly a dark horse for Rookie of the Year because of that. She knows how to play those roles, and she has the talents to be a difference maker at this next level. And if she gets the offensive roles and offensive opportunities with those top end players, I could see her having a surprising offensive season versus maybe the expectations for her as a second round pick. I kind of look at what Jen Gardner did last year, where as a second round pick, she's maybe not at the forefront of your Rookie of the Year expectations, but has a phenomenal rookie season playing with elite talents, helps those elite talents find another level as well, and ultimately is on the Rookie of the Year ballot. So Ella Huber is the final one there of the 4 I have as the legit contenders to help fill that offensive void of Hilary Knight. And again, going back to the Knight conversation earlier, you're not replacing Hilary Knight with one player. You're not replacing Hilary Knight with even 2 players. But if you're going to replace Hilary Knight's offensive impact and that void she leaves offensively, you're going to have players like Gabel and Rattray and Orard and Huber and others step up in those roles. Those are the 4 that I key in on as players that I think could take those offensive steps with the offensive void being left by Hilary Knight. Another one from Jay on Twitter, is this Alina Muller's team going forward? I guess so. At least offensively, yes, certainly. She is the top dog offensively. She signed up for another 2 years after this when she was protected over Hilary Knight and Hannah Bilka, which was a legit conversation to protect either of those players over Alina Muller. They ended up protecting Muller. This is her team offensively going forward. I guess this is Aaron Frankel's team. Really, when I think about the MVP of this team and who that is, it's still Aaron Frankel. And it probably was Hilary Knight last year. But overall, this team lives and dies by Aaron Frankel. If Aaron Frankel posts a .930 save percentage and like 25 starts, this is a playoff team. If Aaron Frankel is a .915 goaltender, they're probably going to have a harder time making the playoffs if she's just kind of a good goaltender instead of an elite, no doubt about it, goaltender of the year player. And Aaron Frankel is easily either the first or second best goaltender in the world. I'll let you decide which one you elect to pick for that one. But for me, in terms of whose team it is, offensively, certainly Alina Muller. In terms of the captaincy, I think it's going to be Megan Keller. But in terms of whose team this actually is, in terms of the MVP, no doubt about it, most important player on this team, it's Aaron Frankel for me. So for me, just looking at whose team this is going forward, it's Aaron Frankel for me. Offensively, though, definitely Alina Muller. And a final question here from Jay on Twitter asking, we lost a lot of defense to expansion and free agency. How does our current back end stack up to what we used to have? Now, everyone in free agency in the expansion draft either got worse or looked very different. And certainly that's the case for the Boston Fleet here. I compare the two back ends, and the top end is better with Keller and Wynn, but I think it drops off a lot more than maybe some of the supplementary pieces that the Fleet had on the back end last year. So if we just compare 1-to-1, Keller still there. Second piece, Haley Wynn versus probably Sid Moran or Jess DiGirolamo. I'm taking Wynn over both of those. But then you get to Zoe Boyd. I probably take Jess DiGirolamo over her. Daniela Pesheva played in a lower role than both Emily Brown and Emma Greco even. And then Ryland McKinnon and Hadley Hartmetz both played lesser roles than Sydney Bard. So the top end, in terms of the top two players there on the back end, definitely a higher ceiling. But I think there's less depth, or at least less proven depth, on the back end versus last year. And that's, again, going back to the inexperience and the youth on this defensive group for the Boston Fleet this year is what makes me so excited to watch it, because there is exciting young talent on this group in the likes of Hartmetz and McKinnon and Pesheva and Brangman and other players that might crack the roster that are free agent invites as well. But with that youth and inexperience comes growing pains and errors and mistakes. And that's going to make some Boston Fleet games very fun to watch. It also might cost them some points in the standings, especially early on in the season as some of those players get adjusted to their new roles. So again, comparing in terms of stacking up to what it is like year over year, I think ultimately I would lean towards last year's group just because of the depth of the group. But certainly the high-end potential is there with the Keller-Wynn 1-2 combo, and then some of the depth that you have on the back end in terms of young pieces that could step up into those roles but are currently unproven. We're going to wrap up each of these previews with a fun segment that we're going to get to in a second, and then a roster projection and ultimately a best case, worst case. But before we get to that, this fun segment I'm calling simply My Gals. It's very straightforward, just the players on each roster that I believe in, either more than consensus or players that I just really appreciate watching. Usually going to focus on players lower in the lineup, not the star players at the top of the lineup that you already know, giving some shine to maybe some lesser players that don't get as much attention for each of these teams that I either believe are more important than maybe are talked about, are players that can either step up into bigger roles and maybe succeed in roles that they haven't been given the opportunity to. Lots of different things there. The idea is essentially taken from Dmitry Filipovich in the Hockey PDO cast. He has his guys, their guys at the beginning of each season. They talk about their guys throughout the season. Well, in the PWHL, the equivalent there is My Gals. So let's begin with my gal, number 1, Teresa Schafzahl. Schafzahl hasn't played a lot in terms of playing like 13-ish minutes a game, not really getting any top 6 opportunities, a lot of bottom 6 play. But what she's done over these 2 years is just being a defensive stalwart. In her 50 career games in the PWHL, she's won her 5-on-5 minutes, 17-10. She's in the 94th percentile in 5-on-5 goals against per 60 based off of the numbers that I have accumulated from the PWHL box scores. And she's just a very reliable bottom 6 player who has some slick hands and some good speed and some offensive ability to maybe push higher in the lineup with all the moves that happened in expansion and maybe push into a higher role this upcoming season. She played a lot on a line with Hannah Brandt and Jamie Lee Rattray, and maybe that's just a trusted line that Chris Spar ends up going with as well. But I'd also love to see Schafzahl get a shot with maybe Alina Muller or Susanna Tapani in a longer role. You look back to her final couple seasons at Vermont, she scored 46 goals and 91 points in 65 games. Now, certainly those offensive totals haven't been there in the PWHL yet, but I look at her defensive results, her two-way game, and maybe some of the potential that she still has. She's still only 25 years old. She's still a player that I really like as a bottom 6 player, certainly, and somebody that I think could maybe pop a bit more offense if she's given the opportunity to. Continuing on with my gals, we'll make this one brief because I've talked about her quite a bit already on the show. It's Ella Huber. As mentioned earlier, I had her as a first round grade. I had her as the 6th or 7th prospect in the draft, depending on whether you valued the positional value of Kendall Cooper more or just the raw potential of Ella Huber. I kind of went back and forth between them in the 6 or 7 slots. But for me, Ella Huber was that next best forward in this draft because of her speed, because of her transition ability, because of her playmaking skill, because of the success that she's had playing with an elite talent in Abby Murphy at Minnesota. She can play center. She can play the wing if you need her to. And I think that she has the potential to be a legit top 6 offensive contributor And in a league that is dying for both defenders, but also offensive game breakers, I think that Huber has the potential to be a game breaker offensively. And as mentioned earlier, I think she's a dark horse for Rookie of the Year, depending on how she ends up being used early on this season. So my gal, Ella Huber, certainly in that group for me. And finally, rounding out this group, it's a player, again, that I've talked about a little bit on this show. It's Zoe Boyd. And let's be real, Zoe Boyd is everybody's gal, especially because of the influence she has in terms of her social media presence, how she is helping promote inclusivity in the game and helping just promote the game overall. She's such a great voice to have in the sport and advocate for the sport, but also just looking specifically in this case on the ice. I look at her transition from being a bottom of the lineup defender, playing minimal minutes, to being somebody that was leaned on in important defensive minutes in the playoffs, somebody that can play the left and the right side as a left-hand shot. And I just think that the way that Danielle Marmer talked about her at the end of the season in that draft press conference, talking about the signing of Zoe Boyd and talking about her being a top 4 defender that every team wants on their team, I think she's going to prove that this season. And I think with her getting the opportunity to play 20 plus minutes a night, day in, day out, is going to do great things for her and her upside and really help her grow into a legit top 4 defender in this league. So that rounds out my group of my gals on the Boston Fleet. Just to recap there, Teresa Schafzahl, just love her game as a bottom 6 defensive winger or center even, and somebody that I think could show some more offense than what she's had the opportunity to do in this league to this point. Ella Huber, who I think is going to be one of the top impressive rookies this season, and Zoe Boyd, who I think is going to step into a top 4 role and succeed in that top 4 role this upcoming season. Okay, so what's the best and worst case for this Boston Fleet team? We don't have the actual playoff format confirmed quite yet, so I can't give you any certainties in terms of that. But in terms of best case scenario for the Boston Fleet, I think you have some players step up on the blue line into roles that maybe you're not expecting. I think you get great rookie performances from Haley Wynn and Ella Huber and Olivia Mobley, a player that I quite like as a bottom 6 piece going forward. And I think ultimately it comes down to Erin Frankel. If she posts a .930 save percentage, you're probably talking about the Boston Fleet as a top 4 team this upcoming season, just because of how elite she can be between the pipes. If she's a bit more human and has a good but not otherworldly like .910, .915 save percentage, well, then it becomes a lot more challenging to see the Boston Fleet being a true top contender in the league this upcoming season. So best case scenario, I'm going to have them as the number 4 team out of the 8-team league. And the worst case scenario on the flip side of things is the bottom team in the league. If Erin Frankel, with all the games she's going to have to play this season, maybe doesn't have the super high save percentage this season, going up well over .920 or anything like that, you have to lean on some extra players on defense in bigger roles than they're ready for. And ultimately the void of Hilary Knight is too much to overcome. Maybe it is just a developmental year for the Boston Fleet. They go into next summer's draft, which is an elite draft, by the way, and go into next summer with a lot of options in free agency as well. Look to retool quickly, get a top player in the draft, maybe get a big free agent signing. You've already got your 3 key free agents or pending free agents that would be in next year's free agent class already locked up in Muller, Frankel, and Keller. There's ways that you can retool this team going into next summer if things don't work out too well this upcoming year. So I think for me, the ceiling for this Fleet team is a pesky number 4 seed with elite goaltending, and the flip side is the number 8 seed in the league and going into the draft with the number 1 pick. So let's finally look at a projected lineup going into this season in terms of a combination of realistic outcomes, but also some outcomes in terms of some things that I would like to see. So starting on the top line with Alina Muller shifting to the wing, she could easily be at center here as well, with Shea Maloney on the right wing and Chloe Orard on the left wing. For me, I'm just sticking her on the left wing because that's what we saw her as last season. So on the top line here, I've got Muller, Maloney, and Orard. Maloney down the middle because she has the size, presence, can be a forechecker alongside Orard, and then the connection of Muller and Orard on the wings. Second line of Huber, Tapani, and Gabel. I really like Huber in the top 6 here with a finisher like Tapani who doesn't take a lot of shots but converts on a lot of her shots, and another top end scorer potentially in Loren Gabel. I really like the idea of Gabel shooting and the playmaking of Tapani and Huber on that second line as an idea there. Keeping the third line intact from last season of Schafzahl, Brandt, and Rattray, we see a lot of those three playing together. I think it's a line that really works, can eat some defensive zone minutes, can also chip in a bit offensively. And then rounding out the forward group, Saulnier, Sheppers, and Mobley. That's just a nasty, hard to play against fourth line that can honestly give you some really good minutes against some better players. And I also like Laura Kluga as the extra 13th skater on the roster. On the back end, as mentioned, I would start with the Keller-Boyd pairing and then go to Pasheva-Wynn on that second pairing. If Hadley Hartnett shows well in training camp, I would be tempted to go with her on the top pairing with Keller and then go to Boyd and Wynn on the second pairing, but that's a lot to ask for Hadley Hartnett's coming after a season where she barely played. So I'm going to start Hartnett's on my third pairing with Ryland McKinnon, and then I have the rookie Riley Brangman as my seventh defender. And then between the pipes, Aaron Frankel and Abby Levy, pretty easy 1-2 punch there. And that does it for this opening edition of this PWHL podcast series, going team by team, deep diving and previewing every single team leading up until the November 21st season opener. Next up, we're going to be doing the Montreal Victoire. So if you have any questions about the Victoire, feel free to leave those in the comment section. I'll also be requesting questions regarding that team on Instagram, on Twitter, and feel free to submit them on Discord as well. So thank you for watching. I'm Kyle Cushman. This has been the KC Show, getting things ready for the PWHL season. We're only a few weeks away, and man, I'm itching to watch those games. Thanks for watching, and have a great day. We'll see you next time.